Okay, hi everyone. I think we're ready to start. Okay, thank you everyone for coming tonight. We're very excited that you're here for this term's AAXX100 event, which is titled On Presentation. I'm Marchi. I'm the curator of the public program, and
my name's Eleanor Gorn. I'm the librarian here at the AA.
And both of us have been involved in the AAXX100 project since the beginning, which was, I think, over 3 years ago now.
And I'm just going to explain very briefly what AAXX100 is. It's a project which aims to not only celebrate the contribution AA women have made in the last 100 years, but also serve as a catalyst for a wider discussion of women in architecture. It's a multimedia project consisting of an exhibition, lectures, seminars, a website, an international conference and publications, including a collection of historical and critical writing about AA women. The project will culminate in the centenary celebrations this autumn, beginning with the exhibition which will open on the 7th of October.
So tonight's event is part of a larger series that we've been organizing together with some AA students and recent graduates. And this is the third one in the series of more interactive events to kind of question different tropes within architecture. So tonight's event will focus on the portfolio by Zaha Hadid, Planetary Architecture Two. There are 2 copies on the table, so after the lecture, we encourage you to look through them. And we've asked 6 tutors from different parts of the school to present this project in the way they felt most appropriate, building on how they would instruct their students to present. It's been quite an ask because obviously this is not their project, and it's open to interpretation, but following their presentations, we'll break into a larger discussion on kind of what makes a good presentation.
So before we hand over to the main speakers, I'm just going to say something briefly about the publication and the series that it formed part of and how it comes to be in the AA library. So Planetary Architecture Two was part of the Folio series, which was a publication venture initiated under Alvin Boyarsky's leadership. And it was an innovative way of publishing exhibition catalogues and was part of a wider exhibition strategy. And in a way, it's kind of how, it's where an exhibition catalogue becomes a work of art in its own right. Marjonovich has called them the lavish folio series. He says they consist of high-quality reproductions of drawings culled from AA exhibitions and packaged in exquisite black boxes. In fact, the Planetary Architecture Two is packaged in an exquisite red box, but a lot of them are in black boxes. Planetary Architecture Two was number 2 of the series. Number 1 was titled Daniel Liebeskind Chamber Works, which was a catalogue of an exhibition held in October 1983. And the series went up to folio 14 in 1991. The format of the series was, as I said, a boxed folio or case containing a booklet with text and also numbered loose plates, and some of the plates were sometimes silk screened. The library's been proactively collecting this kind of literature published by the AA or about the AA to build up a history of the school. And the folios and the other catalogues produced, such as the themes series, now form part of the special collections, although we often have duplicate copies which can be lent. And in fact, in the library, we have 4 copies of Planetary Architecture Two.
So just to briefly introduce our speakers, for those of you who don't know who they are. Melinda Markey is the head of first year. She's taught across nearly every part of the school, including intermediate school, diploma school, and media studies. Mark Cousins is the head of history and theory. His Friday evening lecture series have taken place in this room for the last 3 decades. And he's probably the only person still lecturing here today who's never used any slides, visual aids, or, as he just reminded me, notes. And then I guess we can move that way. Mark Morris is the head of teaching at the AA. He previously taught architectural theory, history, and design at Cornell University, and he did his PhD at the London Consortium, where he was focusing on models and scale. Then Sylvie Taher is an AA graduate. She teaches a history and theory course on the portfolio, and she also teaches an Inter 5. And she is, for the last several years, has organized the HTS Writing Prizes. Then Maria Fedorchenko is the unit master of Diploma Unit 8. She's also the founder of Plakat Platform, which is a collaborative platform for provocations. She's previously taught as part of the HTS courses, Housing and Urbanism, and the AA Visiting School. And then finally, Ryan Dillon is the unit master of Intermediate 5. He also teaches history and theory and is the coordinator of the DRL program. So as mentioned, we're going to start with some brief presentations by each of our 6 tutors, and then we're going to break out into a larger discussion on the presentation. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Okay. So I'm Melinda Markey. I'm the head of the first year. So many of the students probably study in the first year here in AA, so they know when we say that we don't present work, but we show the work, and the work has to speak. So, I mean, I could have come here, just show the portfolio and just silently, but thought maybe it was a bit silly. So I'm going to try to show you, or to give you some suggestion on how you can show the work instead of how you can explain the work. I mean, just to give an overview, the Zaha portfolio is a collection of 6 work. 2 that were done in AA, 1 were done when she was working at the OMA, and 3 are competition that she did when she set up her own office. So it is a bit of a range as well between academic as a starting point to set up her own way of doing architecture instead of using the word practice. In particular, I'm going to show you 3 points. One is the media of the work. The second one is the space or location of the work. And the third one is the audience. So first one is the media. So if you have the portfolio and you need to show it instead of present it, how do you synthesize or how do you edit your body of work? The suggestion here is to, instead of thinking how you can explain it, how you can give the larger picture by doing an extra drawing. I mean, if we look at the Zaha portfolio, her first plate is called Earth Plate, 89 degree, and it showed the collection of her work. So she's kind of, I think, trying to legitimize her own way of drawing, not only as a way of representing, a way of making architecture, but really as a tool of inventing and exploring. So in that sense, one suggestion will be to have a consistency of media, which means embrace your own visual language. When you need to talk about your project, use the media language that you used also to explore it, to invent it. One second, need to. Second point, space. So the space or the location of your work. So again, how do you show the work? The focus is how the work is shown instead of how the work is explained. I often hear students say they need to rehearse. I would say what you need to rehearse more is probably how do you locate the work in the space and not what you're going to say. So in a way, like you should plan that the juror or the audience, they should enter your work instead of enter your thought. And they should be embraced by the visual language that you're using. So in this case, you see the drawings, of course, start to take over different surfaces. So suggestion again, rehearse the work in space instead of rehearse your speech. Point number 3, and last one. What happens if your audience still doesn't get it? You know, like sometimes you can show as much you want, but still they don't get it. So how to make the work accessible to an audience? The work, as you can see even here, is still at the center. The work should be your focus, not too much you talking. So you should not have your work as a background noise or as a background image cover up by you presenting. But instead you should be kind and probably guide the audience to see your work. So in this case, like we see a lot of time that architects point. I mean, when you point is good, it means that you really care about your audience to see and understand what you're trying to do. So suggestion, direct the eyes of your audience into your work by pointing. And pretty much I'm done. So I'm just going to say that, just the last thing, that I don't want it to get a bit misunderstood. When we say not use of word, we don't mean that talking about architecture is not important. We just want to say that a visual language is essential, is the way how we talk, actually, and the way how we experiment and invent a way of doing architecture. So sometimes when we use discussion, there should be a way of trying to figure out how we can, even purely with a visual language, make it more accessible to an audience that is completely, let's say, alienated about what you're doing. So that's the reason why sometimes the talking should have this kind of emphasis, just to help out, make a language, visual language more clear. That's it, I'm done.
I'm trying to think about Zaha's presentation. I actually did a presentation with Zaha when she got the commission to do a sort of slice of millennial dome. I was going to kind of curate what went inside the cake. We worked out that we wanted to kind of just have not very much. Basically artworks or materialized experiments that said something about perception. Quite often these were kind of really well-known psychological mechanisms which you could provide interesting artistic materializations of, especially in the field, obviously, of visual perception. We presented one evening, three of us, myself and Doris Sachi, to a group of about 50 of the most boring kind of business leaders of the UK. All kind of people like David Putnam, you know, who've got one chance and they ruin a large industry, or in Britain, something like cricket. I always think, like, when they've ruined their institution, they then rebrand everything and get Michael Hopkins to come and do the building, like at Lords, the House of Parliament, you know, utterly failed institutions. These people didn't react very well. They were full of the most poisonously disingenuous remarks, like, well, I like contemporary art, but what happens if my wife doesn't? Zaha said, why don't you just say you don't? And it went on a bit like that. There was one particularly odious banker who said, you've really done nothing for ecology. At this point, if you remember, Zaha, when insulted, used to raise herself up. It was, if you've ever seen it, rather like a very angry cobra. And then bite. She said in a sort of mock gravity, nature and I are hardly on speaking terms, which seemed to bring the decision. At the end, I seem to remember her just pulling out with the three of us, saying, this is fucking ridiculous. Looking at these, I mean, if you think of her introduction and Ken Frampton's, I thought they were really lamentable. I mean, what they make you think is no more than the fact that their presentation of Zaha is now incredibly dated. They're all sort of muddling around problems of postmodernism, and in particular, I suppose Ken's more responsible for it, the idea that there was something called constructivism, which was the avant-garde in the Soviet Union, and whose wonderful potentiality was finally crushed by Stalin's repression and inserted into a domain of something called socialist realism, and then somehow is brought to life. I mean, it became active when Zaha did the design of the show at the Guggenheim on the Soviet Union. I think that story is basically completely wrong. It's fabricated in the West for the West. Unfortunately, we have at the AA now a really rather brilliant PhD being done on it by a Portuguese student, so you'll be able to soon read it. I mean, what they really do, and what you must not do, is they do a kind of architectural babble. You know, it sort of makes a historical point, sort of makes a point about architecture, but none of them add up. And only a couple of years later, they look as dated as, you know, they are the flared trousers of theory. Looking at the drawings, you realize that they never get to grips with the drawings. I mean, they may physically show them. I was struck in drawing 6, is it, the slabs, that at least Alvin, in his interview, which is a good deal simpler, but more direct, and actually more illuminating, talks, I think, at one point about her wish to capture, first of all in drawing, but then in architecture, of an explosion. And it struck me that one of the strange things in the drawings is the very consistent use, well, not consistent, inconsistent use, but very considerable use of shadow. And there's a problem about the shadow. I mean, it doesn't necessarily seem to me to belong to that genre of drawing. That's fine, I don't mind it being there. It's got nothing actually to do with the movement of the sun because the shadows aren't consistent. And if you cut further then to a problem which I remember experiencing in the office, is it was at a time of the introduction of the computer, or slightly more sophisticated computers, and a number of employees were working at the time on a repetitive task of what was called in the office putting some of the drawings into the computer. And you realized that, in a sense, if by that was meant rendering the drawings more accessible to drawings which were closer to design, it was sort of impossible. Or, another way of putting that, it was down to the student, down to the employee to make crucial decisions. I think at that point, and from then onwards, you could detect a certain weakening in the design, which I think probably other people recognize, though perhaps not with this explanation. Somewhere there's a real, and so like the problem of drawing is the one of that kind of drawing that leaps out at you, because the shadow functions in this kind of explosive terrain as a way of disciplining it and binding it together. But somehow that shadow is inevitably a very fictional dimension. So I couldn't agree more. You know, the important point is to show, and there should never be a doubt in the mind of a student that to show a problem well is much better than to describe a virtue badly. No one minds if you say, I've seen what I've done and I've got this problem, here it is. It will show that you have powers of self-criticism, which will be very useful. We can go on to talk about presentation in general later. Sorry to go on.
It's on the desktop. I just need to move these out. Should I just close Thank you so much. Max. Okay. Okay. I took a slightly different approach. So I decided to re-narrate the contents of the portfolio and some of the affiliated ideas in a kind of a trial presentation of someone who's actually trying to look at the work from outside and probably from a kind of a larger point of view. So how do we approach this dense body of work? And could we start with one image, or perhaps a meta image? And what would an image that may not necessarily be present at first help us unravel? So what I suggest we do as a presentation trial is a kind of a loop, analytical loop, so that it takes the strengths of the work and utilizes it as a method that it would allow us to unpack and then repack the various facets of the work. So the first way to understand the project, such as the peak, and the image that might stand for it, as a kind of a collapsed, laminated context. So in my first part, I'd like to talk about those two worlds, two domains coming together. One is what used to be the urban ground, and one is what used to be the architectural figure. Both are uncomfortably coming together. One is in fact constantly decomposing and interacting with the other, and yet the two are refusing to separate or somehow integrate in a cohesive whole. So with these two pieces of work, I'd like to think about somehow a more contemporary issue of relationship of architecture in a city, these two domains and how they interact. So if we think of a city rendered as a landscape, and a lot has been said about this notion of urban landscape as a dynamic kind of terrain that underlies a lot of understanding of proto-context in Zaha's work. And here we see the city being rendered as a dynamic system. So a lot of other works that are not present in the current portfolio perhaps help us understand if the city can be seen as a much more multidimensional world, and within the domain of the drawing, the attempt to represent multiple scales, multiple points of view, multiple systems of the city interacting, and in a way subject the city in the process of the drawing to both kind of analytical dissection and an opening of new corridors and territories for intervention. And then ultimately, what I find most interesting in the drawings of the peak is this kind of coincidence and delamination of what would be the utopian and what would be a real dimension that is present in other works, ultimately teasing out architectural possibility that could be sitting in tighter crevices of the city. So the minuscule scale of the club should not be misunderstood for its kind of deeper urban potential. And suddenly then we would look at the project as a much more complex exchange loop between the architectural object and the urban field that is reiterated by the diurnal cycles of the painting. But what is then this sort of complex reality of division and reintegration that refuses to come together? And here's the second point I would like to make. If we would like to understand the fate of this architectural figure, then perhaps we have to look at another set of processes that seem to contradict each other, the process of condensation and the process of diffusion. And here I'd like to refer obviously to the disciplinary references that many people have written about and are referenced in the catalog, which is the avant-garde precedents of the suprematism and constructivism. And now I think that one way to understand the club itself, the drawings that line up with the club, is to again extend it slightly in the disciplinary discussions of these mediators and the chains of influences. Obviously the drawings that refuse to cohere a stable figure in the club could be understood in the context of Zaha's earlier works that look at the object being an urban device, a mediator, a bridge, a programmatic transfer point as seen as a museum of 19th century, which is of course inserting itself into a discussion that is led by some of her teachers, such as Elias Zengelis and Rum Koolhaas, and the early collaborations that Zaha undertakes as part of OMA. Now here, of course, we can see kind of shadows of Leonidov and other figures that are influencing her teachers in turn. But there's something else. The elements that are actually very neatly forced into a framework, here in Zaha's early work, refuse to land, to contain themselves into a single architectural construct. And here I would argue that's the key, the notion where the disciplinary mediators such as Zaha is able to traverse a much longer sequence of references by taking something like a Malevich's suprematist constructions, embedding them with programmatic baggage, then re-embedding it in the context of the city, and then again lifting it up in the visionary realm of the drawing. The third point is whether we can actually find another way to understand this ever-proliferating explosion of fragments, samples, and I would not call them elements for the fear of reducing them to a modernist language. And so here, what do we then have in that box? We have a series of frames. Perhaps they're scenes. Perhaps we can walk through them, approach the building, enter the void, have some perception of potential programs that would play out against its surfaces. Perhaps we can get disoriented. Perhaps we could lose even a kind of a perspectival connection to the object. By exiting the object, we can place ourselves again at that larger landscape. And just as we think we're losing any sense of a coherent volume, perhaps we're reminded of it again. What are those scenes? Is it a cinematic sequence? Are we walking through a trajectory, but are we still trying to put together a single building? I don't think so. So what is then the ultimate difficulty of presenting a body of work like this? I think is because we are ultimately confused as what is the consistency or integration of parts into a whole would mean for a project then, in the Zaha's time, and ultimately today. We don't want to put things together in one single image, and we actually need to pay attention to the cultural, to the intellectual attempts to tease a project together. And here the model of the exhibition, the catalog being its kind of graphic product, and the references that we can make to other exhibitions that Zaha herself designed is a key. If we understand that sequence of plates as something that has to be curated, published and put in a stream of architectural culture, and ultimately as they being put in a box, that is the ultimate coherence, that is the ultimate consistency of the project, and that is where I think the power of black or red square can be found. Thanks.
Okay, maybe taking a similar approach, but to Maria, and talking about how the sort of the object into flowing into the city and this sort of reading of Zaha's work. I also took the prompt from Monia to really try to present this body of work by Zaha in a way through my sort of reading of it. So I sat down with the red box without reading any of the text at the beginning and just looked at the images and started to create a text that I could present the work through. The reason sort of I'm doing this in the way maybe, I don't think I would say this is what I tell all my students how to present. It definitely isn't, but in a way what I do tell my students within the unit that the presentation itself should stand alone as a piece, and that the drawings themselves, of course, should be read and understood to convey the project and its ideas without the text or the presentation. So on one level, I see them as two separate entities that can add different layers to the project itself. So that's extremely important when we talk about and do writing assignments within the unit. We talk about how you explain your project in one sentence, in a 2-word title, in a 300-word text, or in a constraint-based piece of writing. And this allows someone to sort of have standalone pieces of writing that also become presentation material that convey the project. But then the drawings themselves with no text also need to sort of do the same thing. So I see what I'm about to present to you as a collaboration with Zaha in looking at her work, but also layering on sort of the way I might approach a presentation. I'm not saying this is the correct way. In fact, it might be a wrong way, and that would be a good lesson as well. But in looking at the images and my understanding of them, as well as looking at the titles that she put in the book, in the collection, I pieced together, let's say, I'm not going to call it a poem, but a piece of text based along a few rules that I gave myself. And then each one of these pieces that are in the collection are ordered within a table of contents. And so adding to this, I reconfigured the order to sort of tell a new story about the project itself. I was happy to sort of see, after I did this, I read Kenneth Frampton's introduction to Planetary Architecture Two, where he talked about the piece as a cursive script or calligraphy or a piece of text to be read. So hopefully my sort of parallel piece of text alongside Zaha's adds new layers to it. So I will hold up the card and the drawing that the text represents as I read through this. So I will begin. A tandem choreography, off kilter, human error, into water of perfect architecture. A blue-black backdrop, courtyard views, flat plains, gray tones, and objectified architecture. A living space, museum columns, 20 homes, rooftop patio around a void. An elite level at top, a separation of demographics, a floating penthouse. A lower level, repetitive occupancy, one space, all uses, a disconnected world. A political habitation, prime example, 2 minister, green envy, and toast Guinness. A city below, light reflecting, on facades, causing shadow, 59 yellow places. An architecture connects, bridging land, making connections, seeing red, through painterly tectonic. A material link, overpassing fabrics, into layers, a palimpsest, 19th century exhibited. Into meandering streets, merge right, an intersection, drift left, a park looms. A slab flows with movement of people and traffic, a slow ooze. An inhabitant walks through streets, around buildings, into squares, merging into space. A flickering ember, dark ground, dark night, lit structure, lights from within. A dotted line, connected planes of green and red floating in space. A controlled nature, concealed indoors, splitting outdoors, through drawing a broken frame. A contoured architecture, projectile slivers, sliding down, melting in to a contoured mountain. A blue spot within fields of layers, slipping down into an abyss. A spatial gap, suggesting absence, volumes explode beyond sight and into a void. A planet below, consuming oceans, fading landscapes, active architectures, our palette Earth. So I would describe that obviously as an experimental way of presenting your work, and hopefully we can talk about ways of doing that after we conclude. Thank you.
You sure? Yeah. It's fine, we'll just keep it open for Mark.
Okay. I'm Sylvie Taher. I teach in history and theory. I have a confession to make. This is not my slide. This is Mark Morris's slide. I'm in a dilemma of whether I should leave it up there because technically I did not plan to incorporate this. But okay. This is a thing. I think essentially a presentation is a construct. And in the discipline that we work, everything that we do aspires to become a construct at one stage, whether it's a drawing, whether it's a presentation, and that responsibility falls on every single piece of work that you produce, irrespective of if it's a small model or a sketch or 2 years of work, or in this case, 7 years of work. So this is my construct based on the brief given by Manije. So when Zaha wrote her introductory text to the Red Book, there was one kind of two phrases that really jumped out at me, and they were as follows. The 20th century triumph of technology and our accelerating and ever-changing lifestyle has created a totally new condition. These changes, despite their difficulty, have a certain exhilaration which is yet to be matched in architecture. We, the authors of architecture, have to take on the task of reinventing modernity. So that, in brief, that idea of reinventing modernity is what I, as a practitioner, as an architect, as a student, was confronted with. How do you go about presenting somebody who's trying to do something which is as grand as that? My response was to ignore the hard and fast rules, which I always tell students. So the hard and fast rules that I always tell students are the 5 W's. Stick to the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why. I was taught them when I was 16 in high school. And the basic premise of them is if you cannot answer the 5 W's of a story or of a project, you haven't gotten to the base of it. If you cannot answer the who, what, when, where, why of a project, you are on a very, very strong chance of finishing with a one-liner. So why then am I not presenting Zaha's work through the 5 W's? Despite appearances, this is not because in the face of confrontation I'm giving up because Zaha did it better than I did. But rather that in a case as this, I don't think we can use the one-size-fits-all formula. What that means in terms of every student that I've given advice to on the 5 W's is something that maybe has been brought up so far 5 or 6 times already, which is that the 5 W's, granted they didn't speak about them, but the essence of a project is communicated in every single piece of work that you make in that project. Every single drawing needs to communicate. Her work, in a sense, does communicate. What that means is if you produce consistently throughout the year and throughout your careers, drawings that communicate, models that communicate, details that communicate, it then means that when it comes to the moment of presentation, you have a lot less stress on you because you don't have the anxiety of explaining or validating any of the work. You then are free to add a new layer of meaning onto the work. It so follows that when I look at her images, sorry, let's see, excuse me. Ooh. It so follows that when I look at her work, and I'm reminded of James Joyce's Ulysses, with a complete and utter deconstruction of the modern language, I'm entirely validated in choosing to finish this presentation with a quote from Ulysses. My Latin Quarter hat. God, we simply must address the character. I want puce gloves. You were a student, weren't you? Thank you.
I'm Mark Morris. Since coming to the AA in January, I've noticed this tradition of real desk-crits table reviews with pieces of paper put on a flat surface, becoming a kind of, well, a dying species, not here at the AA, but elsewhere. And of course, that format has limitations, but it also opens up some possibilities. Looking at the sequence and spread of Planetary Architecture Two, You see 5, what I would call sort of prelude projects, followed by an expanded project, and they total 18 plates. And there's a process there, a narrative woven into some of the images. They all might be read as part of a larger manifesto, and that's stated explicitly in the foreword. What's also stated explicitly is the promise that this is work which will lead on to other work, which I thought was interesting, and I wanted to know, well, how exactly would this work lead on to other work? For the purposes of presentation, it helps to focus on what's on the table. And what is there is more than meets the eye, more than 18 drawings. So I've organized in the library, just to satisfy myself, that first set of 5, and then the first 2 gatefolds, and then the remainder of the set in order. And I began to see some odd things about the cropping, about the proportions of some images. They're not all full bleeds. Some of them are letterbox. What is going on? Why this diversity in the printing? And I began to see in the upper right corner moments where one image starts to slide into the next fortuitously. Or even within a single plate, how certain drawings or certain projections start to slide one into the next. This reminds me of things like diptychs, for example. But maybe more useful is it reminds one of myrioramic plates, cards, these 19th century parlor games, right? Where you could lay out any sequence of these plates and create a continuous image, something more than the sum of their parts. This was picked up by writers who used them to construct narratives. Some of these plates, these mirror-ramas, were printed in Bloomsbury, not far from Bedford Square. And they're sort of endlessly fascinating because the drawings aren't necessarily autonomous. They're always about linking up at certain critical junctures, and you can see certain graphic devices that guarantee certain alignments across the series. So if we imagine that the series of 18 plates is a myrioramic set, we can begin to see how Planetary Architecture Two is one big heuristic device, more than 18 plates. Certain alignments can become useful for other images or other ways of thinking. That's a sort of standard set you can buy today. But the minute you throw down 2 plates, and some of them in sequence, you start to see that there are alignments or possibilities, and it also starts to explain why the palette is slightly repressed from the originals. There's certain reasons why there's only 4 registrations of gray, for example, to permit these cross readings. And what you begin to see are new sorts of projects, or projects hidden in the cross-referencing of different plates. And they just keep coming up time and again. New edges, new vectors, new corners, new worlds. And there's something dreamlike about it, where one scene can slide into the next. There are no jump cuts. There are no fades, but a continuous surface, which I think Zaha intended. If we want to think about this as a way of presentation, we might kind of cover this in 5 points. One would be opening up this series to the serial, the iterative, sequential habit of drawing anyway, a kind of storytelling or cartooning. Another would be that juxtaposition and chance formal readings has a kind of solid root, a history in surrealism and automatic techniques. So this is just another exquisite corpse exercise. A third point would be to looking at the permissiveness of all this, that the drawing sequence treated myriorhamically, if you will, permits a degree of serious playfulness to be a part of the project. It also knocks the sell-by date of any drawing. They remain more open-ended, perhaps forever young. They certainly remain more useful. And this sequencing, this abutting, acknowledges the way that the creative mind makes connections between projects and representations with all the time anyway, right? In other words, one can advocate for myrioramic way of presenting, because that's part of the creative process anyway. How many other worlds are hidden in the worlds of the 18 plates? And I think there's a coda for this, a kind of hint in the introduction when Zaha presents her brother's Eaton Square house design, where even the line drawing plays that myrioramic game, one drawing flowing into the next. The connectedness, however tenuous, is there. They're meant to be stitched up. They're meant to be read doubly. Which means that all of these drawings are chimeras. They can all offer up multiple heads or different ways of reading the same creature. And if we think of the folio in front of this one, we could look at this as a project of the folio series as a whole, that in Daniel Liebeskin's chamber works or Micromegas, you see drawings that are intended to spawn other drawings, right? Drawing as a heuristic device. And these become creative wells that you can return to again and again. Whenever things get dry creatively, such projects like Planetary Architecture Two or chamber works will always save you. They always offer up more. They always offer a kind of card game where chance and luck and strategy have a space to really operate. Because really a drawing or any presentation of a drawing is always a window onto something else. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all 6 of our tutors for a series of very diverse presentations. The point of doing it this way was to pick a project that none of them had any, I guess, part in the creation of, but then ask them to, or force them to engage with it, and which everyone did in a very unique way. But the point was to expose how there are multiple ways to present the same project, and not necessarily that one is better than the other, but that how we can find equal value in these different ways of presenting. So obviously we have a mic to pass around, so if anyone has questions for our speakers, please raise your hand, I will come find you. But to start the discussion, I kind of wanted to first ask each of you what were the challenges in presenting this portfolio as opposed to presenting work that you had created. I mean, I think, Ryan, you said that this was a collaboration between you and Zaha, which I quite liked. And I think, yeah, that the way it kind of forced you to think about her while also preparing your presentation. So.
I mean, I think on some level, it might even be easier sometimes to present someone else's work because you're looking at it through your analytical eyes, and you can come up with great observations like Mark came up with in terms of the how things are connecting. So because you're so detached from the work, I think it's much more difficult, like in the asking a student to present their own work that they've been so engrossed with all year long. But I guess for me, what I tried to do is also make it my own, or make it part of a different kind of project. Maybe not my own, but as I said, a collaboration, and where maybe this text, which isn't that great piece of poetry, but can sort of stand alone or be worked on just from my sort of analysis and looking at the work, Zaha's work.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I kind of really agree with Ryan on that, and I think it's probably quite a good exercise for most students to do. The last time I presented anything, I was presenting my own work, and invariably what happens is there is a degree of trying to validate it, trying to kind of defend it, which often gets in the way of expressing the core ideas of the project or even opening up the discussion in any way that really matters. So in a sense, it was very unexpected, but I think probably quite a good thing for everyone to have a go at once, to see what it's like talking about something that you don't feel like you have to defend, and it's kind of okay if nobody likes it. quite good.
I mean, I think in a way that leads on to the fact that several people have talked about presentation as being a form of communication. And sort of everyone says that. But we never actually trust that. And we're certainly not rigorous about it. You can think of forms of pedagogy. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the way the psychoanalyst Lacan worked with his students. Normally, in some way, the person who's being trained to be an analyst gets at the end to present their training patient and an account of what they understand by psychoanalytic theory. Lacan stopped that and said the student who's being examined will communicate to someone they choose, a friend, and pour into their ear everything like they know. And then the friend will be examined. You can see, if you're examining, as it were, communication, that's extremely good. I mean, you could imagine it in an architecture school where, in a sense, only the tutors were to present the students, and you would watch hawk-like to see how good a job you thought they were doing. Not always very good. You know, I mean, what happens if you're convinced they've completely missed the point? But that in itself might be quite a good thing. Especially really, I mean, I take the school because obviously I know it very well. I think before we talk about presentation in the school, we need to remind ourselves, I mean, you've been going to lots of juries recently. The basic point is they're pretty awful. I mean, you know, you sit there, you want it to be good. It's very rarely. And you realize after a while that the student thinks of work as the work they're going to present. They don't necessarily think of the presentation as part of the work itself. I mean, first of all, we need to get a clear understanding of why presentation is part of the work. I mean that in a literal theoretical way. Your presentation is like a mechanism of editing your project so that the project becomes much better, much clearer, in a sense, much simpler in the good sense of simple. So when I first came here kind of full-time, I remember going to, I think, the worst presentation I've ever seen. It was a student who said, I mean, she was pretty vague at the best of times, and she was trying to remember what the brief was. We're working, each of us, with one of the human senses. Then there seemed to be a 10-minute pause. He said, I'm doing hearing. It kind of went on. After about 20 minutes, we got to the point where she said she wanted to make an ear and had experimented on what you could see for the photos was a perfectly clean kitchen. Sure wasn't clean after you saw the experimentation. Everything was burned. Finally, after several months, she got an ear, brought it to the AA, but unfortunately dropped it and it broke. You got this infinite, depressed autobiography of the object. She ended a way which you think, no, I'm going to scream. We've been doing us all that, and the site is a disused building site, which is now a car park by London Bridge. And then she said, but next term, as if she's threatening you, we're going to Rotterdam. And you just thought, please don't do this. It's just awful. Now, I don't think I've ever seen something so bad, but I've seen sort of quotations from it. What we really lack is an idea, like a full sense of what presentation means. In a pre-modern way, the relations between people were all expressed by presentation. You had your order, your rank, whatever, and I would present one to another. I mean, it still sort of happens in ultra-polite circles. But the whole, we use it in very archaic senses now. I think bishops are presented when they get sort of the job. You sometimes see in theatres, like so-and-so presents. You have to imagine that really existence was drenched with this relation of everything having to be presented, and presented well. It obviously encourages a formal language and, in a sense, formal relations. And that since the early 19th century, we've gone into a mode of what you might call informality, which makes presentations very difficult. In the cultural industries, in a sense, they are all having to reinvent presentation, but it's not a presentation like I'm trying to sell it to you. I mean, it's an exhibition of it, it's a showing, a telling, but it's making it over to you, in some sense. And the performative element even of a silent picture is now fully recognized. So sort of at one level, everything is presentation. It's not a cynical advertising kind of claim, it's for real. And that's why a presentation has to be crafted. Maybe if there's time at the end, I run a course on presentation. One of the always the best presentations we have is when I've commissioned students to do awful presentations, because it demonstrates they actually know. I think sitting around the room, I can only see Vanya, who did the bad one beautifully last year. Let me just tell you what the ones they can't speak now because they're visiting from Penn, what they did. I say, go and prepare a really bad presentation. They came back, they showed us 3 drawings while giving a commentary. You didn't really know what the drawings were, but they sort of had a kind of architectural feel about them. You were quite happy to think, well, yeah, quite, but I don't really see it, what it is. So you allow yourself to be pushed along and thinking it's architectural, but I can't see what the architecture is. Then they had a kind of talk. And it seemed in this talk that about 6 words came up quite commonly. And they seemed to refer to what was going on in the drawing, so you weren't quite sure. Anyway, it goes on like that. And you think, well, the talk, it's as if you've gone a bit deaf. It's like I didn't quite hear what they all said or took it in, but it kind of sounded architectural. Then we asked them to explain what had happened. They said they got the 3 drawings by writing to a friend in Pennsylvania, send us 3 drawings, don't tell us anything about them. So they knew no more than we did. When it came to inventing the talk, they chose 6 words which had to crop up quite a lot in what they were saying. But otherwise, they just talked, which came so fluently to them, the sort of normal architectural babble, the sort of, geometry came in a bit, various words came in a bit. And you couldn't make it out exactly, but you didn't feel you could exclude it. It sort of sounded. Now, obviously, in architectural terms, as in any other terms, you've been shown and heard something which is completely pointless, completely meaningless, whatever. But you had sufficiently kind of suspended your judgment, and you almost expected people to say, well, I thought that was quite good, but you could have pushed it further. Or, you know, the kind of cliches that jurors actually do say. Or I was reminded of something, or as if jurors themselves also have this babble. So it's presentation, it's got to be constructed, should be very clear, and you forbid yourself any kind of important sounding babble.
Well, just to bring up something else that Mark Morris mentioned at the start of his presentation, he said that the table format or verbal presentation is a dying art, but especially across other schools of architecture, they don't present their work at the end of the year. The AA is one of the few schools where students present their work. Usually it's presented by tutors or you just hand in your portfolio. So I guess, I think it could be interesting to talk about what are the merits of doing it that way, and I mean, it's also open for everyone in the room to contribute to. So is it something that we should continue? I mean, I know where I stand on this, but it'd be interesting to hear from a devil's advocate.
I mean, I was struck by the kabuki nature of it initially. I thought it was a strange ritual. And at the same time, the critical distance, the pressure to acknowledge that the drawing was something that would be looked at from a certain vantage point, at a certain scale, in a certain sequence, you know, which is, I think, all about the Planetary Architecture Two folio, is somehow, maybe it's an antique form, or maybe it's unique, we could say, to how the AA organizes its curriculum or the finale of an academic year. But again and again, you are hearing observations that wouldn't come from more generic modes of presentation. So there's something about that frame which I would say is valuable, or maybe worth taking stock of as we think about what is the AA as a school.
I think also, if I could add to that, this is partly also in response to what Mark was just saying with these Penn students, which I think brings up another thing, which is the relationship that you have as someone presenting to the audience, right? And the problem is very often the audience is bored, and very often the audience isn't listening. So the idea of having or constructing a presentation which on which your work is dependent is a very dangerous position to put yourself into. If you have, if in order to understand me, you have to verbally be, you have to, you know, attentively be paying attention to the words coming out of my mouth, you're at risk of people not understanding, because that happens. Some of the jurors will hear some of the jargon, be kind of happy with it, and miss the point or whatever, which kind of brings it back to the importance of the work that's actually on the wall and the way that itself is constructed. And that frees up the presentation to become something entirely different. I think what it also does, which is very valuable, is it confronts students who are eventually going to go out into the world with an audience that simply isn't that interested, which is what's going to happen when you meet a client, right? There's no one who's going to be as excited as, you know, oh my God, like this is the best design. And they'll be like, well, I just wanted a bathroom, actually. So, you know, in a sense of dealing with an outsider who doesn't share your enthusiasm, but with whom you still have to talk and work, I think it's a really good practice.
Can I follow on that point? I think that there are two issues we're discussing here, and two different ones. One is the actual construction of an argument that would tie the project together or make it a project rather than a design proposition. And the other one is the delivery, the performance of this. And I think the performative aspect does engage with the issues of the temporality of that event and the audience that is present. But I think it's even more important to talk about what Mark was alluding to, I think, is the intellectual effort that goes into brutal editing and construction of an argument that would be presented as the larger disciplinary project in architecture. And I think that whether it's performed on that particular occasion or whether it's written and published as a book, it's a completely different question. And I think that is very important for our students to engage with. And I think that goes back to the question, the original question is, how do you present the work? The work, whether it's the work of a famous or lesser known student of architecture, it's the same. You have to construct your reading of it, and from that reading, you actually become an author. You actually culturally appropriate the work and construct something else out of it. There is no singular correct reading of it. So you, even with your own portfolio, the way you reshuffle the plates, the way you change the chronology, the way you change the reading by adjacency or the extension, is a creative project. And I think to exclude that project would be to deprive our students of a very valid practice.
I think that in a sense, at the moment of the presentation is really the construction of an instrument or a knife with which you reshape the project. Therefore, you know, the presentation stays after the presentation. It's really become, you know, the new account of the project, which you then use in a design way and an intellectual way to formulate the project as the project. I think that's kind of one aspect. So, I mean, it's certainly not, you know, about kind of tips to help you talk more effectively and, you know, at the performance. It's not an independent skill. It's, I mean, in a sense, you become a writer, not when you write something, but when you first cross out a word. You know, that shows that the presentation and the writing go together.
Does anyone have a question that they want to ask?
Hello. I would like to appreciate Mr. Dillon's way of representation of a presentation. So this sort of a didactic and a curatorial approach, which I have not seen. You know, if you're presenting a project, certain words that you chose, my art history teacher used to tell me that if you're describing a painting to a blind man, how would you describe that painting, you know? The most obvious, the most in-your-face sort of systems, and then you kind of talk about that. But I have an argument against that sort of a non-theoretical approach and a more, you know, minimal approach towards a representation of something of that sort of, you know. Aren't those drawings sort of paradigmal in nature? You know, they're like theoretical, and can those few words describe or represent a presentation? It's just an open-handed question for all of you, but what would you say to that?
I guess first, I appreciate your formality, but please call me Ryan. But I guess. I'm from America. I mean, I'm from America, so that's how we. I know. I understand. I am too, obviously. So I get it. It's fine. But I guess I wasn't trying to necessarily explain all the depth of the work, of Zaha's work, through the text I wrote. I was actually trying to write a standalone piece that could sit by itself, that also was sort of emerged out of my reading of these pieces. So I agree, there's, you know, I think Maria touched upon sort of the much more deeper theoretical aspects of the projects, or the project itself, in her presentation. I was trying to find a more experimental way, or a different experimental way of presenting that could open a discussion about sort of if that's clear, if it's worthwhile. I'm not sure it is clear in the way I presented it, to be honest, or if it's something that would be advantageous for a student to present that way at a table. I think if you do it in a way like that, it has to be extremely rigorous. And it's actually much more difficult than, let's say, just putting together a basic presentation. So, no, I don't think it shows the entire depth of the theory behind her work.
No, but if a student manages to create something like this, then I would say that your approach can be quite instrumental because the drawing talks a lot than the words that the students choose to talk about in a jury or a review. So that for sure, but still an intellectual and a more in-depth perception of a drawing or a painting or anything is required for a student of architecture, because that is I would say one of the most important forms of communication, you know, to kind of talk about what you are presenting. But this is only possible in, you know, for certain architects like Zaha because of the theory she already had, you know. So.
You also, I think, asked an important question in what you said. You said, how would you describe a painting to a blind person? I found myself one afternoon looking at a painting I really love in the Wallace collection by Fragonard. Standing next to me is what appears to be a blind woman with a white stick. She says, "That's my favorite painting." I said, "But I see from your stick you're blind." She says, "Why would that stop me having a favorite painting?" She said she talked to people at that painting because it's beloved by a small population. And so she's many times had it described. Quite what she's made of that, we shall never know. But that she's made something, and it's something very important to her, is absolutely the case. You might think that it's actually a bit more difficult in the case of architecture, because in a sense, unlike painting, we don't have an obvious common language to talk about architecture. It's one of the fundamental problems with architecture. You know, some of the terms we use to describe a building are everyday words like window, door. Some are kind of pseudo-tectonic or actually tectonic. Some are from the history of sort of stylistic categorization. And so you will have noticed, which is why people fall back on, and it's not only non-architects, but fall back on talking about the gherkin or whatever. It's a very, very difficult problem in architecture, its relation to linguistic description, which I kind of feel because I prefer to try and describe a building in words than in an image, because I'm not teaching imagery. And I think you can't just keep on giving photographs without giving an account of photographs.
I think maybe one other thing, because you talked about sort of an architectural student needs to talk about the theory that's sort of driving their work. But actually, I don't know if I agree with that, because I actually think the work itself should communicate that. So I'm always telling my students, don't try and sound smart. Your work is smart, right? You can sound as simple as possible in your writing, in your presentation. But through that, what's on the table and what you're saying, that the theory comes out, it's clear to everybody. I think when students actually, or any of us, try and sort of overcomplicate the presentation and use the jargon that Mark is talking about, is when the presentation actually becomes problematic. So I'm always trying to talk about it being like as simple as possible, and let sort of this material sort of speak.
So maybe if I can jump in, just because I think that with the first year, I think they're used to it. We do silent jury. I mean, the idea is not, I was saying before, is because we assume that when we say we are going to present the work, means we're going to talk about the work. So I have a problem with the assumption that presenting means talking, that the change of media, not to go back with Mark's point before, there was a moment where the drawings end up inside the computer and they were turned into render. So they were, when a drawing were used to explore design, they were turned into drawing to represent design. And the shift of media is what for me always kind of is the problem. So shift of media is not about talking or presenting, it's really about if you're using a specific medium, can you show the work with that medium instead of start to render, instead of start to talk? So it's really kind of the consistency of the media that sometimes is missing, and that is what. So of course, I still believe that it's a strength in AA. At the table, students are present. I don't mean students should talk. I mean the author is present. Then, you know, like which medium we use, then is open. But the fact that the author is present with the work, I think is essential.
I mean, supposedly to talk about the work, you need this thing called critical distance. And what was interesting about the setup Manajay organized was that these books were placed in the library. We could go and touch these things, which I think on eBay are, a clean copy of this is, you know, 4,000 pounds or something. And immediately you look at them and they're annotated to death. People have written on them. There's a Marmite stain on one of the plates. And you start to touch these things, and I don't know, critical distance kind of ebbs away. It's still hard to be critical about this thing from 1983.
Didn't Manajay quote someone on the boxes, who was it, that said they were, you know, single sheets, highly, beautifully printed, and put into, you know, an amazing little red box. These are boxes they used to put records in.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you're looking at partly the genius of Alvin, how to do expensive-looking things for almost nothing. I mean, when the AA was really short of cash, this was the kind of thing he could throw out, and good luck to him if they're 4,000 pounds to go. He would just think he should have gone into publishing.
Should I start before they start? First of all, thank you for this great presentation and just having different perspectives on this kind of approach. The word kabuki was mentioned, which is the Japanese theater. The kabuki is a mix of 3 words, which is sing, dance, and skill. There was a few comments, actually many comments, that was kind of disregarding speaking. So speaking is not good. It's the imagery using the presentation. Words like anxiety was mentioned, students having anxiety, not being able to talking too much, and really depending on drawings. As students, we should be able to use every means possible to do a good presentation. So if speaking is one of those, why shouldn't we use it? But more importantly, yes, we have anxiety presenting, and we might have trouble with it. But as our instructors, if you guys don't teach us, then maybe that's why we're not so good at it. If we're supposed to be presenting, and architecture is important, I think. I like to think architecture is important. And if we're talking about political, social, economical issues at a party with some friends, shouldn't we be able and taught in school to actually capture an audience?
Can I? I think one thing to make clear, I don't think anyone here is disregarding the importance of speaking about architecture, but I think the one thing, at least for myself, which I'm really trying to get across, is that presenting your work is one tool amongst a variety of tools which are open to architects. I don't expect a drawing to do for me what a model can do. I don't expect a render to do what an installation can do. my problem, and I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, that what's being brought up is when a student expects what they're saying to take the place of a drawing or a model or whatever, an installation. Ultimately, one of the challenges that you all face is to understand the tools that you have available to you and to figure out and edit what you use when and how to what purpose.
Can I maybe, because I think you were doing eye contact, so I feel like I should. Okay. Also because I think, you know, like, especially with the first year, we really tend to say quite a lot about no speaking, etc. There is a reason for it, and you know, like we always ask the students when they use words. I ask them like, why, when you use words, is because you really want to say something, or is because you don't know how to draw it, or you don't know how to make it. If I feel the students say, well, actually, I'm saying it, I'm using words because I don't know how to do it, they're here in order to learn, so I feel my responsibility to teach them how to first to experiment by doing. So that's kind of, I would say, there's a bit of the pedagogic thing that I feel, you know, like they speak when it's a plan B, when they don't know how to do it. So in a way, that's kind of my internal battle with the first year to make sure that they don't use language as a way of escapism. So I hope in that sense it's solved. Then if specific students say that actually words, writing is an essential tool for them to explore and invent, then I tell them that do not draw and write. So this is like the medium for me is very important as a tool of exploring. Doesn't matter which the medium is.
Can I, sorry, really quickly add to that, because you said write rather than speak, and there is also a distinction there. Because the difference between a drawing and, say, just a conversation is I can't work into a conversation, right? I can't take out a pen and work into it. I can, when I'm writing, work into that in the same way that you would into an essay, into a PhD. Ultimately, the question asked is, are you creating a platform which enables somebody else to engage with it? Sorry, I just wanted to highlight that writing is totally valid, not...
Yeah, I think maybe just...
And I think the point I make about speech is that the problem we have with speech is that we tend to think it's natural. You know, it's just we open our mouth and out comes what we think. Actually, what comes out naturally is rubbish. So speaking also has to be learned. You know, it's a more sharpened skill than just kind of blabbing. And speech is the, you know, in life in general, not architecture in particular, but it's undoubtedly the major, probably the major instrument you use. So you have a world full of people who said, sorry, what did you say? I didn't understand you. I mean, most human relations are made up of non-communication.
I mean, just to kind of offer an admission, you can tell within the first few words of a presentation, as a critic, if there's craft in the words. And when that happens, I have to look away from the work. It's just a habit. I look away from the work and just hear the words. Maybe it's a multitasking issue, I don't know. But to take that as its own piece of the presentation, distinct from the work on the wall, and then to somehow have to synthesize them afterwards. As a critic, I think that's part of the responsibility. But you know right away if that's the tenor or the focus of the thing. Occasionally, students have said, you weren't really into my drawings, right? Because they see me look away. It was quite the opposite. I was interested in their words for that component. So I think there are ways every critic has to grapple with the fact that, as you say, this is a sort of multimedia idea, the presentation.
But just to make a point from the point of view of the student, right? Just to disagree slightly, perhaps, with some of the points that we've tried to make. I hear you. I hear you because I think when I was a student, I was lamenting the same things, and I think I was not taught properly how to construct a presentation, how to deliver a presentation, and how to match the intellectual construction of the project with the graphic part. And so I think that is one of the problems that we're having this event today is we have to we have to come to terms with the problem of presentation on different levels. And of course, as teachers of architecture, as academics, we can talk about much more sort of conceptual, theoretical dimension of that, and how the work becomes reappropriated, culturally reconstructed. But I would like to address your question from the point of view of a student-teacher relation. And by all means, I think we are diminishing our students' capacity in critiquing both their inability to edit and frame the work from which they have no critical distance, the inability to write, to then rehearse, construct the speech, and then live deliver the performance, and then also to match that performance perfectly with some sort of shuffling, pulling the models, flipping the thing around. So, I mean, it's not just learning how to speak, how to all these things in the same time, and how to use very different skill sets. So I think by all means, you should be able to be taught in architecture school how the editing and framing and delivery of presentation could be done as a kind of a set of combined skills as you would be done with the drawing. I personally disagree slightly with some points that speaking can be curtailed at some point, or the project needs to be visually delivered it depends on the stage of your education. But I completely agree with your criticism of architectural education when it comes to the delivery of that crucial component, in my view, which is the spoken, the delivery. And I think the stupid point I would make, if you look at some of the most powerful interactions, whether it's politics or marriage, in fact, you know, the miscommunication and embarrassing flops that we're witnessing around the globe, if you actually think of people being extremely successful, it's people who can talk. And architects talk. First and foremost, they need to talk about their work to protect their place in the world. So I think in that sense, if there was one crucial skill, I would say we need to teach its ability to speak.
Wasn't Zaha a very, very bad lecturer? I think she, I mean, I totally see the point, but it's a way, you know, Rem is fantastic lecturer. Zaha, I remember, Rem I remember being really good, and Zaha I remember not being brilliant, and really the focus being on the drawing, and it's kind of okay. I think it's there, it's available for us to use and to kind of embrace your natural tendency.
And explain why Patrick is called her theoretical spokesperson?
No, that's
I'm going to interject just to say, sorry. I don't think it's actually, I think it's also about your relationship to the work. I think hearing Zaha speak about her early work and the paintings, she was very eloquent, and she was really, I went to a lecture with her and Brian Clark, and it was one of the best conversations I've ever listened to. I think actually when we were students, it was Sylvie who asked this question about when she made this decision to step away from being the single hand to letting more people into that. And it was then that her lectures changed. I think whenever she talked about like gossipy stories of the day, she was a great storyteller. So I don't think she was a bad presenter. I think sometimes your passion only communicates when you're actually that involved in the work. And that's actually the flip side maybe of what you were saying, Mark, about critical distance, in that a lot of the times when we present here, we have no critical distance. Even as tutors, you have no critical distance. You're so embedded in the project. But I guess it's about like how you communicate your enthusiasm and passion as well. I mean, I've seen projects that I would never think would convince any audience or any panel of examiners get high passes, because the enthusiasm of the student and their commitment to do every single thing possible to communicate that idea has won through. So I think sometimes it's also about your passion and involvement. And in a way, Zaha is a good example of that.
Okay. I personally think it's a very individual case. So I do agree also with Monia's approach, and also I agree with Maria saying that actually giving us the tool and teaching us the ability to speak about our projects in the right manner, if we apply it afterwards or not, it's at the end our choice. But also, I was in Monia in first year, and she did teach a lot about how to present. I will never forget, models can never be on the floor. It's like, there are like a couple of things about our presentations which I obviously learned in first year, which I do apply. but every tutor has also their own way, and every student has their own. Some do express better in writing, and some are better in drawing, and some are better in presentation, and it has nothing to do with the words that come out of the mouth, rather at the way they present and do it. So it's also confidence of people. So all of the points are great and amazing, but I really think that actually if the school would give a tool, or schools in general, not the AA per se, would give a tool of a speaking course, then people could attend or not attend, but if somebody feels that they need more confidence or explanation, that would be
Yeah,
an
I
amazing
mean, like
tool.
we were actually speaking before that the media studies should have this kind of courses also about posture. What you know, like, I mean, you know, because I mean, at the end of the day, if it's about presenting, and if you look how people, when they present, which courses they take, well, you know, like voice control, I mean, there is quite a lot of these kind of courses. Then yes, I mean, if you want in the media study, they could a bit expand.
Absolutely agree
and
with Monia,
embrace
because
these
I have
courses.
to,
Why not?
occasionally I have to vet my students' wardrobe for the final table.
No, but
You laugh, but I mean, I can think of fashion schools where students get marked for how they look like in the morning.
No, but it's also a very crucial part of, if you're coming to present your project, and obviously your drawings
Yes.
are amazing because you go through the school and you really put so much effort into it, then you should also look appropriate to do that.
There are, yes, but there are problems with that. One of which is, you know, it's very likely that people have like a misunderstanding of how they ought to look like. I mean, they oughtn't to look like as if they were going to a funeral or even a wedding.
Okay,
I
this,
mean,
this has taken an unexpected turn. I think we can settle with, you have the space of the presentation to curate.
We can
how
agree
you-
there's no end to what you could take care of. And that's true because whatever end you take it to, you're actually thinking about the presentation. Clothes, I can just imagine being actually a rather good instrument to think of a presentation for. I mean, everyone needs, on the one hand, like more discipline, but on the other hand, more freedom to work with objects that can help them realize their ambitions. The two are very strange combination, but to my mind, they're always characterized. I mean, you've been talking about Zaha. I don't think Zaha liked lecturing at all, or even possibly speaking. I think she thought sometimes she almost had an obligation to show herself. I mean, show herself in the sense that she, of course, knew perfectly well that she was her own project. You know, I mean, it would be difficult to think of someone so from the bottom up, utterly constructed. And some people enjoy that. It's the same paradoxical way that I think existed in Zaha and was actually quite a touching, if quite difficult, area. She was like a bully who made people free. And that sounds very odd.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a specific question, I hope it's okay, to Ryan, about the constraint system as a method of presenting. And I was wondering whether you see sort of that tool or like a way to present the work as a way to attract the audience, or rather maybe as a way to connect with the author of the work, so in that case, Zaha. Or maybe on another level, it's a way to further even connect it with yourself, so on more of a personal level.
I mean, it's definitely personal. I write with constraint just to get myself writing, and it's a mechanism for me. Actually, I find it fun. So. I mean, but at the same time, I'm not sure it's very beneficial in a presentation for the audience, in a way, because I doubt anyone knows the constraints that I was using as I read. the presentation. So it's more, I think, of a personal internalized system that I use as a mechanism to write text. I don't think it's for everyone, but I think, but yeah, it's not something, I don't know, did anyone understand the constraints? Alex? So I don't think it's that important once the text is delivered or as a presentation.
Since we are running out of time, and there are drinks waiting for us, so we can obviously continue this conversation longer. I kind of wanted to end by asking all of you and everyone in the room as well, whether you feel, I think that what's great about the AA specifically is the diversity of agendas and ideas that are happening in the different units across the school. But to ask whether you feel that that's being reflected in the types of presentations you're seeing and hearing, or whether they've kind of become quite similar. I do agree there's a difference in, as you said, Maria, in terms of the construction of an argument, which is very project specific, and then how you perform that. But I'm curious to know whether you think that the delivery of a presentation or the types of presentations you're seeing, if they're becoming more homogeneous or if they are very specific to a unit or specific even to an idea or a project, and whether that's something that we need to encourage more or if that's already happening.
I think the one thing I've noticed is I've taught and teach in different parts of the school, kind of from foundation up. And the one thing I've noticed, which is really quite lovely, is as students go up through the years, the variety of presentations really opens up. And I think that has a lot to do, obviously, with the tutors encouraging them and, you know, them becoming more mature and all that. But I think mainly one of the biggest things that really can homogenize presentations is this fear of screwing up. That fear will guarantee kind of dumb down your presentation in a heartbeat. And I think it really helps when students kind of go and see the way other people present, other students present, and they just kind of loosen up and like fall into the process and enjoy it a bit. So I think there's definitely that variety in the higher years. It's maybe lacks more at the beginning, but I think that's a lack of knowledge and like too stiff an idea of what the right way to do it is. Yeah.
Can I follow up just briefly on what you just said with the earlier and later years? I absolutely agree with you, but I find it a natural outcome of the students constructing their own personality in architecture. And I think that as they get to 5th year, it should be as diverse as possible. Because if we are talking about the construction of Zaha as a project, a construction of a figure, a construction of presence in the world that they're going to enter, they should not be conforming to any sort of rule or formula. They should be themselves. And at that last 5th year table, they should technically reject everything we expect them to do correctly at the end, because they've already launching. They are becoming the rocket that Zaha once was, that would depart from this world. And so I think the only message I would say for the students, especially as you get into diploma school, is do not try to do it correctly. Do it the only way you believe is right for you.
Yeah, I think sort of the idea of ownership of a project is really important. And I think even if it's by the time you get to 5th year or within your individual year, you always see at some point during the process the student really taking ownership of their work. And that's when, for me, the presentations actually improve greatly. But that's really important, sort of, so it doesn't become formulaic. And I think that's touching upon something earlier about the table, that at the AA we really need to kind of be aware of this, because the table has so many benefits, and I'm all for it. At the same time, I think it can have students default into like an A2 portfolio presentation that's quite conventional. And I have an issue with that in a way that I think it limits the sort of idea of rejecting, the means and methods that sort of are put forward to you. So I think all students as well as tutors need to be aware of this and push sort of more experimental ways of how one presents work, both sort of the performance of it, the words that are being spoken, And so I find that to be the most important thing.
I mean, I think it's a kind of sweet question, because within these walls, we can be critical of the degrees of diversity or the robustness of a presentation. But I think one of the things we need not wring our hands about is that level of discourse at the AA is still remarkably strong. And I think the organization of a thing like this evening sort of marks out new territory or ways we can improve. But we do so already at a very high plane, and we shouldn't forget that. It's something this place has always done well, and I would imagine that even in this context of where has education maybe faltered in delivering some of these skills, it's a tweak here and there, but the machinery at the AA in this regard, in the question of presentation, is still remarkably well-oiled.
Maybe jump in very, very briefly. Considering that there is juries coming up, I think it's a good opportunity to speak with your tutor and test out a different way of to the tutors, or maybe don't speak with your tutors, and test out like your own way of presenting. Because I think as well sometimes there is a confusion between presentation to jury versus an assessment at the table. They choose different things. So, I mean, as well, your presentation to the jury is not the rehearsal of your table. I mean, the table is an assessment of tutor at another school. A jury sometimes is really presenting the work or showing the work to people that sometimes they're not architects, they're not internal to the school. So it's a different type as well of audience. So I say if we want to first open it up and explore different way, the jury is the easy way, they're available, they're there, you just need to go for it and try it out.
I mean, I really want to just make two very simple points. If we're talking about presentation for a jury, you actually can't really have a good jury, without some good jurors. Now, looking around, you know, it's not uncommon to see really rather bad jurors in two senses. One is that it's not their fault, but there's been a decline in the idea of oppositional juries, where people drop in from a unit that really doesn't like yours. And where, for the beginning, you know, the visitors say, I don't see what you're talking about. Which has, you know, in this adversarial form, although it's people who work every day together, you know, it has a more testing kind of character. As a consequence, I think that it's not unfair to say that some units kind of get their friends to come, and there's a degree of sort of mutual, I mean, normally in an institution you can rely on sort of mutual backstabbing, but here it's like, not quite the same. So I think the students are, in that sense, a little untested. I think the second thing, it's very difficult to know how you would repair this, but the students feel to me far too upset if someone makes a kind of marginal criticism. You know, some of them are kind of like weeping for the rest of the afternoon. You say, you know, has his mother just died? No, but someone said they didn't really like my drawing. And I think that probably goes together with the opposite, you know, somewhat rather too pleased when some idiot juror can't think of anything to say and say, I quite like that. Oh, fantastic. So I think there ought to be maybe kind of slightly more healthy, cynical, you know, either way. It's only really if you feel that you've done it badly that there's an occasion for kicking yourself. What other people think is like maybe important and maybe very important if it's your, you know, unit tutor, but it's not as important as actually how you think about your work. I think you're too easily persuaded that it's either bad or good without checking with yourself to think, what actually do I think? So, as always, students need to be, I mean, perhaps it's the same as critical distance, you know, by the end of the 5th year, what one hopes is one has helped to produce a student who is critical and independent. We ask, you know, we're not a school of different schools. That will satisfy everyone. But you must do it, and it's not easy.
I think that's a great point to end with a call to arms. Before everyone leaves, I just wanted to thank all 6 of our presenters. Despite being very busy with all the things that they're doing, they did all spend quite a lot of time with these portfolios preparing for this evening. And I'm just very grateful for them for doing that, because I think this was a really important discussion, even just if it's the beginning, that you can all take forward, discuss with your tutors and your friends who didn't come tonight. But now I say, let's all have a drink and talk about this in less formal surroundings. Thank you.